Good evening. Let's look at another lesson in our series of science in the Bible. This particular lesson dealing with biology. Most of us have, even some of our younger folks probably have studied at least in some capacity biology. Sorry about that, Brian. I thought I hit the mute. I thought I turned off the mute, but I guess I didn't. There, I think that should get it. Most people have studied, even you get toward elementary school, have studied biology to some extent, in some capacity. It comes from bios, meaning life, and of course, the ology, meaning study of. And so a study of living things is what we call biology. Brother Wayne Jackson, in his book, of course, this is kind of the basis of our series, The Bible and Science, he points out, and I think it's worth mentioning, that it's defining life is difficult. We can know the traits of life, the effects of life, but defining the essence of life itself, that's a different matter. It's not always easy to do that. But we want to look at this in four different key words: identification, origination, replication. Of course, you can kind of see where all these are going. Identification is dealing with identifying life. The origination, well, where did life come from? And then the replication would deal with, well, how does life continue? And then the last point we'll look at is what we call, or I've kind of called, fascination. And it's just kind of about the wonder of life here on this earth. So that said, let's just go right into identification. What is, or what constitutes living? Again, with the understanding that defining life is difficult, but it's pretty easy to determine what it is that would be called living. All material elements of the natural world fall into two categories: living or non-living, but another way of putting that is organic or inorganic. Well, what is recognized as living? And that's kind of what we're dealing with in this particular point. Brother Jackson gives a little bit longer definition. There are a couple times I wanted to read something that he mentions. If you got your handout, by the way, there are handouts, and there are plenty of them in the back or in the foyer there if you didn't get one. But this first handout I think it's under B on the handout, this first blank is metabolism. And that's kind of summing up a lot of things. He talks about it in the book. A living creature is able to take in food elements from the environment, combines them with oxygen, utilizes energy from these sources for the maintenance of vital forces. There's also waste product generated by these biological processes. But that whole thing is called metabolism. Taking in food, taking in nutrients, using that to maintain life. If a creature, or if something does not do that, something in the natural world does not do that, well, it's not going to be categorized as organic or living. We can say number two, can respond to stimuli in the interest of its own well-being. I've mentioned before that sometimes when we were kids, mischievous young folks, there were people in my family at least who would maybe take a BB gun and go out to the pasture and find a little calf and pop that calf on the backside with a BB gun. Well, it responded to that stimuli in a very emphatic way. Sometimes you could pop an old bull or cow and they hardly respond at all, I guess depending on the strength of your BB gun. But the calves would, and we figured that out. We'd sometimes I sometimes even just hesitate to tell that story because I still fear my Uncle Ted and what he's going to do to me if he ever finds out about that. But, we understand that. There's certain, you sit here to this pulpit and I can jab it. This thing just doesn't respond at all. Well, it's not alive. You can jab a rock, you can kick a rock, you can punch the wall. Some people have found that out the hard way. Doesn't respond. But living things respond to stimuli in the interest of their own well-being. There's also the ability to experience true growth. In other words, cell multiplication, that's one example. And when we say true growth, that's contrasted with something that is what we would categorize as non-living may experience growth. In fact, if you get a snowball made up and you start rolling that thing, and many of us have been there and done that, it begins to get bigger and bigger. Well, is it growing? I mean, you're adding mass to it, but it's not growing in the sense of true growth. In fact, if you roll that thing down a hill, it'll really grow, right? We sometimes talk about the snowball effect. But that's not true growth. Then there is life would be defined as the ability to reproduce independent organisms, replicating the original or copying the original type. Doesn't necessarily mean identical, but humans reproducing humans, dogs reproducing dogs, and so forth. Also has to be capable of autonomous movement. This would be contrasted with something like an automobile, for instance, or an airplane. Well, they're capable of movement, but you got to build it to be moved. And there has to be, whether it's a steam engine, a combustion engine, whatever it might be, an electric engine, it has to have something to generate it. Bicycles move, but you can sit on your bicycle all day and go giddy up, but it ain't going anywhere, right? Until you start pedaling. Contrast that, by the way, with some say a horse. You get on that horse, assuming that horse is broken, otherwise you might be off that horse pretty quick. You say giddy up, it'll go, because that horse is living. It can move independently, autonomous movement. And then we could sum up this last one by just saying simply complex organization. I want to read you a quote out of the book. There's so much more that could be said about this, but he mentions, I think I may have this. Oh, no, here it is. I've mentioned this fellow before. In fact, there's this would come from the textbook. There's a biology textbook. I don't know, there may be some schools that actually still use it. It's a pretty old textbook as far as, I think the copyright was in the late 50s, if I'm not mistaken. But sometimes schools will still use these old textbooks or updated versions of them. But the textbook's called Life: An Introduction to Biology. But here's what he says in that textbook. A modern building is certainly a complex and highly ordered structure, but its complexity cannot begin to compare with that of the living system. End quote. Or here's a quote from a science journal that Brother Jackson gives in the book. Quote, a pair of pliers, a chainsaw, or even a missile guidance system doesn't approach the lowliest parasitic worm in internal complexity. The human-made world is not nearly as intricate as the natural world. End quote. Well, the man-made world is not nearly so complex as the God-made world, as Brother Jackson puts it. So, complex organization, that's part of life. Even the most complex computers we can design as humans, they don't come close to even the lower scale of living things as far as complexity. And that's evidence of a creator. Really, throughout this lesson, you're going to see evidence that screams God is. It just screams at us and cannot be ignored. There is a creator. That segues nicely into The second point here, origination. Where does life come from? Well, probably you don't need me to tell you. This is where a number of scientists, not all scientists, but many scientists, and the Bible clash. I mean, head on. Completely different worldviews, ideologies, because evolution argues for spontaneous generation. Whereas, of course, the Bible is going to argue for life coming from God. But evolution argues for spontaneous generation. This is, of course, counter to the law of biogenesis, stating life only comes from life. Now, before I go to this next part, again, I want to mention something here. This is just, it's one of those things that if it were not so serious, it would be utterly hilarious. This same textbook, and I don't know that I mentioned the fellow's name I meant to a while ago, but George Gaylord Simpson was one of the authors, and he was, he's no longer alive, but he was a dare I say, rabid atheist. I mean, he really was a staunch evolutionist. But he made the statement, quote, most biologists think it probable that life did originally arise from non-living matter by natural processes, end quote. And as Brother Jackson writes, unbelievably, on the very same page. It's the same page. After discussing the scientific investigations of pioneers like Francesco Redi, Louis Pasteur, the author confesses that by their many experiments, here comes another quote, it was demonstrated that microorganisms are carried through the air and that spontaneous generation does not occur in any known case. End quote. It's the same page of the book. Well, we've concluded that life arose from non-living things by natural processes. And then on the same page, you say, spontaneous generation does not occur in any known case. Folks, you don't have to be a PhD, a master's, a college graduate, or a high school graduate for that matter, to know that is ludicrous. Where I come from, they say that's talking out of both sides of your mouth. He goes on, Brother Jackson says, never in the history of science has a known case of spontaneous generation been documented. The evidence against the accidental commencement of life is so overwhelming, scientists now acknowledge what is called the law of biogenesis. Again, quoting from Mr. Simpson, same textbook. This actually was on a different page, but he says, quote, life comes only from life, end quote. Well, which is it? You can't have it both ways, Mr. Simpson. But of course, on the other hand, the scriptures teach very clearly that life comes from God. Genesis 1 and 2. We're going to go to Acts 17. I think it's worth turning there and reading just a couple of verses. I've got verse 25. I think it's would be good to back up to about verse 24 and get a couple of verses here. Paul, of course, is standing there on Mars Hill, Areopagus, and he's moved by the idolatry there. They have all these different idol statues, statues to different idols, so-called gods, little g gods, as we sometimes say. He sees one, though, that they've dedicated to the unknown God. Well, we may have left somebody out, so this was just to the unknown God. Paul says, that's the one I want to talk to you about. The one you don't know is the one you've got to know if you want to have hope beyond this life. Him declare I unto you, the end of verse 23 says, God that made the world, verse 24, and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything. But listen to this, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood, all nations of men, for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. The Bible teaches life comes from God. He is the giver of life. And so if biological life is utterly incapable of generating itself, and we've seen that it is, we've even seen the staunch evolutionist George Simpson acknowledge that. So if biological life cannot generate itself, yet, here we are, just us, but all other living things around us, they exist. Well, the only logical conclusion is life must have originated from a source of a different nature. And God is the only logical explanation for that. The Bible refers to him as God, sometimes using the name Jehovah, or as it is in Hebrew, Yahweh. Scholars will tell you still don't know exactly how to pronounce that word, because the Hebrews were so guarded with it for fear of using God's name in vain that they would not even pronounce it. The Hebrew alphabet didn't have vowels, and so it's sometimes difficult to know how to pronounce something that they never pronounced. Turn in your Bible to 1 Thessalonians. Here's another one of those verses that we just notice it quickly, but it's worth looking at. Paul he's sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, we might say he's sort of bragging on the Thessalonians. Not in a bad kind of way, but he's building them up, saying, hey, I'm proud of you. You've been a great example to many others. From you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, verse 8 says, but also in every place your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not to speak anything. Everybody knows. They know about you and your faith and your obedience. But listen to what verse 9 says. For they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how ye turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. And that word living is a present participle. It means he's the God, the being, the creator, who keeps on living. It points to his eternality, having no beginning and having no end. God is the only logical explanation for biological life. If you've got a better explanation, a more rational one, I would love to hear it. I don't claim to know it all, but I have studied this, and I've tried my best to study it with a very open mind, and I cannot come up with even somewhere in the region of being close to a more logical explanation, or an even logical period explanation, other than there is a creator. He is the God of the Bible. We could also point out, and we'll deal more with this in a different lesson, we just don't have time tonight, this earth, this planet, is unique in supporting life. Oh, we can travel to other planets, some of the planets, but even the planets that maybe we can't necessarily put people there, we can send, what's the Hubble Space Telescope and things like that. What did you mention, Bob? Probes. Yeah, that's these different probes and things like that, and they can take pictures, and it's just, you can go to NASA's website and you could just get lost for hours just looking at pictures. The amazing creation that God has put out there, and yet there's only one place that supports life, and that is right here on this earth. Why is that so? Well, it's interesting. I think I have I do have the quote right here. I was going to say I may have to look at it in the book. By the way, you probably have heard various illustrations about the likelihood and how unlikely it is that that life just spontaneously was constructed or began here on this earth. One scientist said it would be like an explosion going off in a printing shop, and that explosion resulted in an unabridged dictionary. That would be about the likelihood of life accidentally occurring from non-life by natural processes. Another scientist said, and the first time I ever read this was reading Brother Jackson's book, he compared it to a bunch of blind men. In fact, 10 to the 50th power blind men. That's a 1 followed by 50 zeros. Did I get that right, Bob? He always makes me nervous when I talk math in your ear, Bob. I just know I'm going to get it wrong. But a 1 followed by 50 zeros. Blind men, you give them all their own Rubik's Cube. It's all scrambled up. And Luke, I know you can appreciate this. My nephew Luke's here. He's good with a Rubik's Cube. You give them all their own Rubik's Cube. They're blind, or at least blindfolded, we'll say. And you say, all right, ready? 3, 2, 1, go. And not only do they all solve it, being blind, but at the same time, simultaneously, they all say, done. That's what one scientist said is about the better chance of that happening than life arising accidentally from non-life. Talking about the earth being unique and supporting life, listen to what, again, George Simpson, that same textbook, talking about how unique it is that in all of our solar system and all the galaxy and all the known universe and space out there that we've seen and been able to discover thus far, none of it supports life except this planet, Earth. Quote from George Simpson, "It seems peculiar, even downright providential, as our ancestors thought it literally was." Oh, he wouldn't dare admit that. Now, isn't that sad? For all the talk about, sometimes people will, again, not everybody, but some scientists will almost mock anyone having faith or believing in God, and they'll say, the only thing I believe in is science. I believe in the data. And yet you would make a statement like that and acknowledge that, boy, it's like it's providential. This is the only place that supports life. Our ancestors taught that. But you just sort of dismiss it. Why? Because you got your own ideas. That's sad. Again, were it not so serious, it would just be hilarious. Let's go on and talk about replication. To put it very simply, life replicates, according to Genesis 1:11 and following, after its kind. Let me go ahead and throw this out as a disclaimer. The kinds, the way the Bible uses that term, they don't correspond to our species that we have today, that scientists have. And sometimes people get hung up on that and they're trying to match them up. They're not, it's not like the Bible was written with God making sure to match up. In fact, the species weren't even around at that time. Those classifications came along later. They don't match up, so don't get caught up with that and get confused. But what it does imply are boundaries. There are certain boundaries between animal groups and plant groups. You have dogs and you have different kinds. And sometimes somebody will say, hey, you want to buy this dog? And I was talking to somebody recently trying to get rid of some puppies. I said, well, I don't know. I don't really need a dog, but just out of curiosity, I may run across somebody. Are you like trying to sell it or something? He said, yeah, $800. I was like, huh. Okay, well, that's a hard no for me, but I may, if I run across somebody, but it's because it's a purebred. But sometimes you have a dog, and most of my pets growing up, somebody say, what kind of dog you got? A mutt. That's what kind of dog I got. It's different kinds. But it's still a dog. You're never going to end up with a cat or a horse or a pig or a human. There are boundaries there. Same thing with plants. These kinds, by the way, also deny the common ancestry of all things. In Genesis 1 alone, some 10 times it is said something to the effect, may not necessarily be this exact phrase, but something to the effect of after its kind. That's a boundary that cannot be crossed. And you know, let scientists say what they will. Let the evolutionists roar and shout. But all he's got to do is show us one example. And then you got a case, mister. But it doesn't happen. There are boundaries there. They cannot be crossed. Scientists, again, many scientists, not all, have this idea that all life came from a common ancestor. But just this whole after its kind thing and those boundaries denies that common ancestry of all living things. Evolutionary thought, evolution itself has an impossible task trying to explain those impassable barriers between the basic groups of biological life. We could go on and talk, and there's a lot that could be said about this, but two reasons. One's time's sake, and one, I get kind of little boats stay close to shore, as they say. I start getting in over my head with this. But there's a coded program called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, if I'm pronouncing it right. That is in the nucleus of every cell, every human cell. It carries all the genetic information that is needed to replicate that cell. And here's an interesting thing. Well, a couple of interesting things. For one, Brother Jackson mentions in his book the information from one human cell translated into English. Some scientists estimate would form a library of some 1,000 books of up to 600 pages each. But here's the thing that I was going to mention earlier. Not only is the information programmed, as we might say, to replicate the entire organism, but there are elements designed to replicate specific features of the body. Cells for a hand, an eye, a liver, a kidney, and so on. And there's unique information there. Code, we might say, if we want to use a computer term. Many scientists have been forced to concede that DNA presents prima facie evidence, as it's called, that an intelligent source was behind it. But DNA, as he puts it, Brother Jackson puts it in the book, is only the program. It takes another chemical mechanism to assemble all the data, all this biological data. And so DNA requires RNA to assemble all that. And so you have this interdependency where RNA doesn't exist without DNA, and yet DNA without RNA produces nothing. How did that come along? If you take God out of the equation. This argues, this marvelous harmony argues, again, as dare we say, it screams design, not just accidental happenstance, chance, evolution, whatever you want to call it. It screams design. So there's this idea of replication. How does life continue? It's so complicated, and yet we're supposed to believe that it just somehow evolved? I don't think so. And then there's another point we want to notice here is this is kind of summing up a lot of the other stuff. The wonder of life on earth, and when we call this, let's kind of sum this up with the word fascination. Here is, I was looking, no, it's not a quote. I thought it was from the book. It is impressive that in spite of the detrimental effects sin has had on our world, and I was looking at that quote on bondage of corruption from Romans 8:20 and following, and I was thinking I had something here where I was referencing back to the book. But what some versions have is the bondage of corruption, and it's just talking about the idea that, as we sometimes say, we live in a fallen world. Sin entered the picture, and Adam and Eve, they were the first ones to sin, but all have sinned, Romans 3:23, with one solitary exception, that being Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So there's a price to be paid, because the wages of sin is death, and a lot of bad things have come about since then into this world as a result of sin. And so that term bondage of corruption is kind of an encapsulating term or phrase for that. But in spite of all that, the fingerprints, as Brother Jackson puts it, of a creator are found everywhere in our world. Just a few examples that we could give of God's fingerprints on creation. This is where I did want to look at something that he mentions in the book. There's so much that we could say here, but he mentions there's, first of all, this balance in nature that suggests intricate planning by a supreme being, a supreme creator. He talks about the initial forms of life upon earth were plants. This is very important, since all animals, either directly or indirectly, depend upon plants for food. Green leaves are food manufacturing plants of the world, and they contain marvelous chemical factories. And they evidence design in so many different ways. He talks about photosynthesis, leaves taking carbon dioxide from the air, earth's water, and nutrients in the soil, and in conjunction with sunlight. From them, they manufacture carbohydrates, which supply energy for animals that consume them. This is called the carbon cycle, of course. The process is so complex that it's not completely understood to this day. But as he says, it certainly testifies to the wisdom of the Creator. Think about the animal kingdom. Rabbits are preyed upon by numerous predators. Accordingly, they reproduce prolifically. They can give birth to as many as 9 kits at a time. The gestation period is only about 30 days. Moreover, 6 months later, those new cottontails are ready to have their own families. On the other hand, elephants have few natural enemies. The female elephant begins to bear babies when she is 14 to 15 years old. The gestation period is almost 2 years. And he asked the question, what if these reproductive features were reversed? The earth would be overrun with elephants, and rabbits would have perished long ago. You see, there's a balance in nature. And you cannot explain that with evolution. You just can't. There's no way that evolution can explain that. What about animal navigation? Still a great mystery. Scientists don't even fully understand it, even when they study it in depth. Ants can wander great distances from their homes, take bearings just by the sun, if it's daytime, or even the moon at night, and find their way back. Scientists can't figure that out. Salmon, they're hatched fresh waters of streams in the Pacific Northwest. Before long, they travel many miles to the ocean, and when they reach maturity, they go back to the same stream bed where they were spawned. En route, they must make scores of choices at various forks in the rivers until they finally arrive in the very place they were hatched. And yet they find it. Nobody's putting up signs, turn here. You go run a 5K or a 10K, or, especially if you run a half marathon or marathon, sometimes there are these signs up. We were going to Peachtree City the other day, and they were having some kind of a bicycle race. I don't know, Jacob, if you ever gotten off course for one of your races, but these people, there was no excuse because they had signs everywhere. Turn here, one of them said. And then there was another one place we were coming up, and it says, turn coming up, turn ahead. And then, finally the last sign says, turn here. I was waiting for one that says, yes, here, dummy. But you know, they don't have that, these animals. They find their way. Birds migrate thousands of miles. An oriole, Baltimore oriole, will leave New York, he says, in the fall for its winter vacation in South America. In May, it will return to the very same tree. That is a round trip of 4,000 miles. The Arctic tern makes a 22,000-mile round trip each year from within 10 degrees of the North Pole to Antarctica and back. One writer comments that his heart, quote, that his heart and wings are equal to this feat is miracle enough, but how does his tiny brain solve problems in navigation that stumped the human race for thousands of years? End quote. There's a lot of value in these bird migrations. It helps control insect population in different places. He goes on and talks about that. He gives another quote from a book called Marvels and Mysteries of Our Animal World, a volume that aggressively promotes evolution. But here's what a writer says in that book. Quote, sonar and computers are primitive instruments compared to the devices, end quote. And he's talking about some of these animals. Primitive instruments, sonar and computers, compared to the guidance systems that these animals just have in their mind, in their brain. How did they get that? How do you evolve that? Let me tell you something. That species is long extinct before they evolved that kind of precision navigation. You cannot explain that with evolution. He asked that in the book. How did these animals survive over the alleged millions of years of their evolutionary history as these guidance features were being gradually constructed? Makes no sense. But if you think of them in terms of being created, makes perfect sense. That's how God designed them to his glory. Well, you ever think about the color in the animal world? I don't know if I'd ever given it. I mean, some things, yeah, but not as much depth. But in the animal world, color is often a life or death matter. We talk about color, we think in terms of camouflage for military and things like that, but you know, a green frog blends in with a lily pad that it's sitting on. He talks about the snowshoe rabbit. It's got brown fur in the summer, it matches the earth. But when winter is coming, he trades his brown coat for a white one. And his will very easily blend in with the snow. Here's an interesting thing. If a snowshoe rabbit loses a tuft of hair in the fall, the new patch that grows in will be white. Now, how does blind Mother Nature evolve the complex chemistry that produced that? I mean, are they getting together and saying, guys, I don't know what we need to do, but I mean, we're getting eaten up right and left because we're brown and the snow's falling and we're standing out like sore thumbs? No, you can only answer that with creation. Many bird eggs, ingeniously designed to blend in with their background, protect the offspring. You can't explain these things with evolution. How did these creatures slowly develop such abilities over so long a time if they needed them to survive? And obviously, in many cases, they do. All these that we've given, they do. How do they evolve that? And that's the question that he asks over and over and over. There's a volume published by the Reader's Digest Association, which also, if you've ever read much of that, you know is quite often can be very evolution-minded and promote evolution. Here's what one writer said. Let me find it. Quote, these devices, again talking about these animals and some of these navigation ideas and such, these devices and thousands like them are not casual happenstance. Well, what is their explanation? He asks. It's just part of nature's This is the quote. Nature's grand strategy. And I could say wholeheartedly I agree with Brother Jackson's sentiment when he follows that up with whatever that's supposed to mean. Nature's grand strategy? I mean, how determined can you be to refuse to acknowledge an almighty, all-powerful creator? Folks, life could not have originated on its own. It cannot replicate itself. There has to be a creator. There just simply is no logical explanation. The world of living things, the natural world around us, it is indeed fascinating. And it's as if God is, sometimes maybe you're trying to get somebody's attention and you're waving your hands and you're going, hello. It's like all throughout nature, God is just waving, hello, here I am. I'm not that far away. And that's kind of what Paul's saying there in Acts 17, the Areopagus. I'm right here. I want you to seek me. I'm not hard to find. You can please me. It's not to say that you can't, you can never do anything to satisfy God. You ever known somebody like that? You said, nothing I ever do to please him. Nothing I do will please her. God's like, I'm on your side. We have to acknowledge that he is, that he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Life is not happenstance. It is a gift from Almighty God. And you know what? So is eternal life. It just so happened that this lesson fell on a Sunday we're honoring our graduates, but this is one of the things that in fact, it's one of the reasons for going through this series again, because our young people need to understand there's zero chance. And that's not to say that us as the older folks don't need to understand it too. There's zero chance that life just happened from non-life. There is a God. There is a creator. And here's why so many people fight against that. Because if life was designed and created, that means there is a creator. And if there is a creator, I'm going to have to stand before him one day and give an account of my life. And some people, they just refuse to acknowledge that, and so they just deny God's existence. Well, you can deny it all you want to, but it doesn't change the facts. Why not get ready to stand before him in judgment? Again, he's on your side. He's on my side. He wants us to go to heaven. He doesn't want anybody to perish, 2 Peter 3:9. If we believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, if we're willing to surrender our life, our will to his, and if we are buried in that watery grave, confessing Christ as Lord, buried in a watery grave of baptism, he says, you'll be saved. You serve him faithfully the rest of your days, and he says, I will give you a crown of life. Paul knew when he was getting ready to leave this life, 2 Timothy 4:6-8, he says, I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. I fought a good fight. I finished my course. I've kept the faith. There's a crown of righteousness that is awaiting me. And he knew that. He says, I know whom I have believed, 2 Timothy 1:12. I am persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. What about us? How am I using my life? It's a gift from Almighty God. Are you using it to his glory? If not, there's never a better time to make a change and do what you need to do as we stand and sing to encourage you.